Picture two 9-year-old boys standing in a small, cluttered office above a grocery store, waiting for a meeting they've been anticipating for over a week, ready to demand something they feel they've genuinely earned. For weeks, they've been working for this man, sweeping floors, stocking cans, doing whatever small tasks he handed them, all for 10 cents an hour, a wage that felt insulting even by the standards of their own young, allowance-sized understanding of money. They've rehearsed exactly what they're going to say. They're going to walk in, explain calmly but firmly that they deserve a raise, and walk out with more money than they walked in with. Instead, something completely unexpected happened. The man, a friend's father, someone the boys have started calling their rich dad because of how obviously successful he is compared to almost anyone else they know, listens to their entire case for a raise, nods thoughtfully, and then tells them something neither boy expects to hear. He's not going to raise their pay. In fact, he's going to stop paying them anything at all. The boys are stunned, then angry, assuming they've just been fired for the crime of asking for fair compensation. But this man isn't finished, and what he says next becomes the foundation of one of the most influential, most argued about financial books ever written. He tells them that most people spend their entire lives working exactly the way they've just been working for him, showing up, doing the tasks they're told to do, collecting a small, predictable wage, and never once stopping to ask a far more important question. Not how do I get paid more for doing the same thing, but how do I stop needing to be paid an hourly wage at all? Here's the question I want you to sit with for the rest of this video, because it's the exact question that reshaped how one of those two boys would think about money for the rest of his entire life. What if the real problem was never how much you're paid for your time? What if the real problem is believing that trading your time for money is the only path to financial security in the first place? The boy in this story who eventually walked away from that strange, uncomfortable lesson with a completely different relationship to money grew up to write about it in detail, contrasting the lessons he learned from that friend's father against a very different set of lessons he learned from someone else entirely, someone who loved him deeply, worked incredibly hard, and never once managed to escape the exact same financial trap he was trying so hard to avoid for his own family. His name is Robert Kiyosaki, and the two men who shaped his entire understanding of money, he eventually named simply, almost bluntly, Rich Dad and Poor Dad. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why he believes one of these two men, despite having far less formal education, ended up building genuine, lasting wealth, while the other, despite an advanced degree and a respected career, spent his entire life financially stuck. And you're going to understand exactly why Kiyosaki believes the single biggest obstacle standing between most people and real wealth was never a lack of income at all. It was something almost nobody is ever formally taught in any classroom at any point in their entire education. Let's meet these two men properly, because understanding the contrast between them is the entire foundation everything else in this story is built on. Kiyosaki's actual biological father, the man he calls Poor Dad throughout his writing, was, by almost any conventional measure, an impressive success story. He held an advanced academic degree, worked his way up to a respected position overseeing education for an entire state, and was widely regarded by nearly everyone who knew him as intelligent, hardworking, and deeply principled. And yet, despite an income that placed him comfortably among the more educated, more credentialed people in his community, he spent much of his life feeling perpetually financially strained, unable to build any meaningful savings, often worried about bills, and never quite achieving the kind of financial security his impressive credentials might have suggested he'd naturally arrive at. His friend's father, the man Kiyosaki calls Rich Dad, hadn't finished the same level of formal schooling at all. He'd started as a small business owner, running modest operations, and gradually built those into a substantial, genuinely wealthy portfolio of businesses and investments, all without the advanced degree, the impressive title, or the formal academic credentials that Kiyosaki's own father had spent years earning. Here's the specific puzzle that consumed young Robert Kiyosaki's attention for years afterward, one that eventually became the entire thesis of everything he'd go on to write. How could two men, one with vastly more formal education, work in nearly identical amounts of dedication and hard work, and yet arrive at such dramatically different financial outcomes? The answer, Kiyosaki eventually concluded, had almost nothing to do with intelligence, and almost everything to do with something his rich dad understood deeply, and his poor dad, despite his impressive credentials, had never actually been taught at all. Financial literacy, not financial luck, not financial talent in the sense of some special inborn gift for numbers, a specific, learnable set of concepts about how money actually works, concepts that traditional schooling, even at the highest, most advanced levels, almost never actually teaches. Here's the first, and arguably most important of these concepts, one that Kiyosaki spends enormous energy explaining clearly because it directly contradicts how most people naturally think about their own major purchases, the difference between an asset and a liability. Most people, if asked to define these terms, would give an answer that sounds reasonable enough on the surface, but that Kiyosaki argues is actually dangerously incomplete. An asset, in his specific, practical definition, is anything that puts money into your pocket, consistently, over time, whether you're actively working or not. A liability is anything that takes money out of your pocket, consistently, over time, regardless of how valuable or impressive it might appear on the surface. Here's where this definition genuinely challenges conventional thinking, and it's worth sitting with directly, because it likely applies to something in your own life right now. Most people consider their own home an asset, the single largest, most significant asset they'll ever own. Kiyosaki argues that, for most people, in most circumstances, a primary home is actually a liability, not an asset, using his own specific definition. Why? Because a typical home doesn't put money into your pocket every month. It takes money out through mortgage payments, property taxes, maintenance, insurance, utilities. Ingenuity out. This isn't an argument against ever owning a home, and Kiyosaki is careful to clarify that point directly. It's an argument against confusing something that feels valuable, something that appears on the surface to represent wealth, with something that actually functions as a genuine, income-producing asset, according to the specific, practical definition that matters most when you're trying to build real financial security. There's a story Kiyosaki tells of a colleague, someone earning a genuinely impressive salary, who nonetheless felt perpetually strained financially, unable to understand where all of his substantial income actually went every single month. When they finally sat down and reviewed his actual finances together, the pattern became obvious almost immediately. Nearly every major purchase he'd made over the years, a larger home than he strictly needed, a luxury vehicle financed on a payment plan, various possessions that looked impressive to friends and colleagues, fell squarely into the liability column, taking money out of his pocket every single month without ever generating any income in return. Meanwhile, his actual asset column, investments that could generate their own independent income, remained almost entirely empty, despite years of substantial earnings. This is precisely the trap Kiyosaki argues, ensnares even genuinely high earners, a trap his own poor dad, despite an impressive salary and an advanced degree, fell into as well, spending on liabilities that looked like markers of success, while never building a genuine asset column capable of generating income independent of his own continued labor. Here's a pause worth taking right now, honestly, with nobody else watching. If you looked at your own major possessions, your home, your vehicle, whatever else feels significant in your financial life, and applied Kiyosaki's specific definition, does each one put money into your pocket every month, or does it take money out? Because, according to this entire framework, that single distinction, more than almost anything else, separates people who are quietly building genuine wealth from people who simply look successful on the surface. Now, let's talk about the specific advice Rich Dad gave those two boys after ending their childhood wages. Advice that eventually became one of the most quoted phrases from the entire book. Mind your own business. This phrase, Kiyosaki explains, doesn't mean what it might sound like at first, some blunt instruction to stop paying attention to other people's affairs. It means something more specific and genuinely more useful. Most people, Rich Dad explained, spend their entire working lives building someone else's business, showing up every day, using their skills and their time to generate profit for an employer, while their own personal asset column, the actual business of building their own independent wealth, remain almost completely neglected. He encouraged the boys, even at 9 years old, to start thinking differently, to begin looking for ways to build something of their own, alongside whatever job or work they might eventually do for someone else, rather than assuming a steady paycheck alone would ever be sufficient to build genuine, lasting financial independence. This lesson led directly to one of the most memorable stories in the entire book, something that happened not long after that initial wage negotiation fell apart entirely. Rather than continuing to work for 10 cents an hour, sweeping floors for someone else's business, young Robert and his friend Mike decided to build something of their own instead. They noticed that comic books, popular among the other kids in their neighborhood, were relatively expensive to buy individually, and most kids, understandably, could only afford a small handful of their own. So the two boys gathered as many old comic books as they could find, from their own collections and from friends willing to lend theirs temporarily, and set up a small, makeshift library in a spare room, charging neighborhood kids a small fee to come read as many comics as they wanted during a set period of time. The idea worked remarkably well, generating steady income from a resource they'd essentially already owned, requiring almost no ongoing effort once it was set up, purely because they'd built a small system, rather than simply trading their own individual hours for a wage the way they had at the grocery store. When Rich Dad heard about this venture, he was genuinely pleased, not because the boys had made significant money, which they hadn't, but because they demonstrated, at 9 years old, an understanding of something most adults never fully grasp. Building a system that generates income, even a small one, teaches a fundamentally different way of thinking about money than simply trading hours for a paycheck ever can, regardless of how large that paycheck eventually becomes. Here's the deeper principle underneath this story, one that Kiyosaki returns to repeatedly throughout his writing. There's a fundamental difference between working for money and having money, or a system, or a business work for you instead. Most people, including his own highly educated poor dad, spent their entire careers exclusively in the first category, trading time and labor directly for a paycheck, a category that, no matter how much that paycheck eventually grows, remains fundamentally limited by the simple fact that there are only so many hours in a single day. Rich Dad, by contrast, spent decades building systems, businesses, and investments that could generate income independent of his own direct, active labor, meaning his income potential was never capped by the literal hours available in his own day, the same way an employee's income inevitably is. Now let's talk about something Kiyosaki discusses with genuine nuance, an area of financial literacy that most people, understandably, find intimidating: taxes and the different rules that apply depending on how your income is actually structured. Kiyosaki explains, through lessons he attributes to Rich Dad, that employees, people earning wages directly from an employer, typically pay taxes on their income before they ever actually receive it, with taxes withheld automatically from every paycheck. Business owners and investors, by contrast, often have significantly more flexibility in how and when they're taxed, legally able to structure their finances in ways that can substantially reduce their overall tax burden, precisely because tax laws in many places are written to encourage business, investment, and job creation. This isn't presented as some illegal loophole or unethical trick. It's presented as a fundamental difference in how the tax system itself is structured, rewarding those who build businesses and investments differently. There's a story of a small business owner Kiyosaki describes, someone who structured her business specifically to take advantage of these legal tax provisions, reinvesting profits back into her own company's growth in ways that were tax-advantaged, in stark contrast to friends working traditional, salaried positions whose entire income was taxed immediately and directly, with far less flexibility available to reduce that burden legally. This distinction, Kiyosaki argued, represents another entire dimension of financial literacy that traditional schooling almost never teaches, leaving most people, including plenty of genuinely intelligent, highly educated individuals like his own poor dad, at a significant, entirely avoidable disadvantage, simply because nobody had ever formally explained these specific rules to them. Now, let's talk about something Kiyosaki considers even more foundational than any specific financial strategy, something he frames as the actual root obstacle standing between most people and genuine wealth: fear. Specifically, Kiyosaki describes this fear as entirely natural, something nearly everyone experiences, and he's careful not to dismiss it as simply irrational, or something people should just will themselves past through pure confidence alone. Instead, he argues that the actual difference between people who build wealth and people who don't often comes down to how they respond to this fear, not whether they feel it at all. Rich Dad, according to Kiyosaki's account, experienced genuine financial setbacks throughout his career, investments that failed, business ventures that didn't work out as planned, moments of real financial stress and uncertainty. But rather than allowing those setbacks to convince him that taking calculated risks was simply too dangerous to ever attempt again, he treated each failure as a specific, valuable lesson, adjusting his approach and trying again, gradually building genuine expertise through direct experience, including plenty of experience with what didn't actually work. Poor Dad, by contrast, according to Kiyosaki's own honest account, was so deeply afraid of financial risk that he avoided nearly any opportunity that carried genuine uncertainty, preferring instead the predictable, seemingly safe path of steady employment, even though that supposedly safe path never actually delivered the financial security he was hoping it eventually would. Kiyosaki identifies several additional obstacles beyond fear alone, patterns he watched repeatedly in people who struggled financially despite having genuine opportunities available to them. Their cynicism, a tendency to dismiss financial opportunities before ever genuinely investigating them. There's laziness, sometimes disguised, Kiyosaki notes pointedly, as being extremely busy, filling every available hour with activity that feels productive in the moment, while avoiding the specific, sometimes uncomfortable work of actually building financial literacy or pursuing new opportunities. There's the power of bad habits, small, seemingly minor financial decisions repeated so consistently over years that they eventually compound into significant, lasting consequences, exactly the kind of quiet, invisible pattern that can undermine even a genuinely strong income over time. And there's arrogance, their existing sense of expertise. Here's a pause worth sitting with, honestly, right now. Which of these obstacles, fear, cynicism, disguised laziness, ingrained bad habits, or quiet arrogance, tends to show up most often in your own relationship with money, if you're being genuinely honest with yourself? Because, according to Kiyosaki's entire framework, identifying your own specific obstacle is very often the actual first step toward building the kind of financial literacy his rich dad possessed, and his poor dad, despite genuine intelligence and effort, never quite managed to develop. Now let's talk about how Kiyosaki's own adult life eventually unfolded, because the contrast between his two father figures didn't just remain a childhood memory. It shaped every major financial decision he made as an adult, sometimes in ways that felt genuinely uncomfortable in the moment. After finishing school, Kiyosaki describes facing real pressure, largely from his own biological father, to pursue the traditional path his poor dad had always modeled: secure a stable, respectable position, work steadily, rely on a predictable paycheck, and eventual retirement benefits for long-term financial security. Instead, drawing on lessons learned from his rich dad, Kiyosaki chose a considerably less predictable path, eventually starting his own businesses, investing directly in real estate and other income-generating assets, deliberately building an asset column that could generate income independent of any single employer or steady paycheck. This path wasn't without genuine struggle, and Kiyosaki is honest about specific ventures that failed entirely along the way, moments of real financial uncertainty that tested his own resolve significantly. But he continued applying the same core principle, distinguishing genuine assets from liabilities, minding his own business alongside whatever work he happened to be doing, treating setbacks as lessons rather than reasons to abandon the entire approach. And gradually, over years, he built the kind of financial independence his own highly educated, hard-working poor dad, despite an entire career of genuine effort, never quite managed to achieve. Here's the specific, somewhat painful irony. His biological father, the man with the advanced degree, the respected career, the genuine intelligence, spent his final years facing real financial hardship, having devoted his entire professional life to a system that rewarded steady labor with a paycheck, but never taught him how to build genuine, independent assets alongside that career. His rich dad, the man without the same formal credentials, left behind a substantial, thriving business empire, having spent decades deliberately building income, generating assets, teaching that same specific literacy to his own children, and, as it turned out, to a curious 9-year-old boy willing to learn from someone other than his own father. This is precisely why Kiyosaki argues so passionately that traditional education, however valuable it genuinely is in many respects, has a significant, largely unaddressed gap at its very center. It teaches people how to become skilled, valuable employees, capable of earning a solid, respectable paycheck. It rarely teaches people how to build genuine assets, how to distinguish real wealth, building opportunities from expensive liabilities disguised as symbols of success, or how to structure their finances in ways that take full advantage of the specific rules that favor business owners and investors over traditional employees. Let's bring all of this into the world you're actually living in right now, because the specific gap Kiyosaki identified decades ago has, if anything, become even more relevant since he first began sharing these ideas. Today, an entire generation faces rising costs of living, rising housing prices, and stagnant wage growth relative to those rising costs, making the traditional path of simply earning a steady paycheck and hoping it eventually leads to genuine financial security feel increasingly precarious, even for people with impressive credentials and genuinely hard-earned professional success. Meanwhile, opportunities to build genuine assets, side businesses, digital products, various forms of investment have arguably never been more accessible, requiring less starting capital than at almost any point in previous history, even as most traditional schooling still largely ignores teaching these specific skills directly. The lifestyle liabilities Kiyosaki warned about have also multiplied in new form. Financing arrangements for nearly everything imaginable, subscription services that quietly drain income every single month, and a culture of visible, curated success that makes it easier than ever to mistake an expensive liability for a genuine marker of financial security. Here's the modern application worth genuinely acting on this week. Something concrete, something you can actually start examining in the next few days. Go through your own major expenses and possessions and honestly categorize each one using Kiyosaki's specific definition. Does it put money into your pocket every month, or does it take money out, regardless of how impressive or valuable it might feel on the surface? Then, separately, identify one small way you might begin minding your own business, building even a modest asset alongside whatever work currently pays your bills, exactly the way two 9-year-old boys once built a small comic book library instead of simply accepting an unsatisfying hourly wage. That's the entire foundation, distilled into two concrete actions. Actions that separated one father's entire financial legacy from the other's, despite one having far less formal education than the other. Let's return, one final time, to that small, cluttered office above the grocery store. Two 9-year-old boys standing in front of a man who had just told them he wasn't going to pay them anything at all. That moment, uncomfortable and confusing as it genuinely felt at the time, became the exact foundation for everything that followed in Robert Kiyosaki's entire adult financial life. He didn't walk away from that meeting with more money. He walked away with something he'd eventually come to understand was worth considerably more, an entirely different way of thinking about what money actually is and what it can actually do once you stop simply trading your own limited hours for it and start building systems, assets, and genuine financial literacy instead. That is the actual heartbeat of everything we've walked through together today. The real difference between his two fathers was never intelligence, or effort, or even opportunity in any obvious sense. It was a specific, learnable body of knowledge that one man happened to possess and generously passed along to a curious 9-year-old boy, and the other man, despite genuine brilliance in his own respected field, simply never had the chance to learn it all. If this reframing, assets over liabilities, systems over wages, financial literacy over traditional credentials alone, resonated with you at all, there's a simple, easy way to make sure you never miss the next story like this one. And honestly, that's really the only thing I'll ever ask of you. Because somewhere out there right now, their entire financial future was never really about the wage at all.